From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa Spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
It took one African captain just 48 hours to accomplish what decades of international cooperation could not, or perhaps never even intended to. 48 hours to rip the mask off the largest synthetic drug network the Sahel had ever seen. Decades of meetings, reports, and conferences, they produced nothing but more corridors for poison to flow. And here's the part that makes certain development partners squirm. The operation didn't just expose criminals. It exposed a system that benefits from failure. You think the aid trucks were bringing hope? No. Some were bringing crystal meth dressed up as agricultural miracles. Imagine that. The same people lecturing Africa about governance were shipping high-purity narcotics under the banner of help. If that sounds outrageous, stay with me. Because in a few minutes, we're going to talk about who signed those documents, where those shipments were headed, and why no one, not a single foreign liaison, saw fit to stop them. Or maybe they just didn't want to. If you think this smells rotten already, wait until you hear what was hiding inside those humanitarian containers. And if you've ever suspected that the biggest threats to African security come not from its own soil, but from the hands that pretend to feed it, drop your thoughts in the comments. This is just the beginning. For years, we've been told the same tired story. Africa needs humanitarian corridors controlled by outsiders because, apparently, Africans can't manage their own borders. These corridors, we were promised, would be lifelines. Safe channels for food, medicine, and hope. But lifelines for whom? Picture the reality. Unmarked convoys, wrapped in the logos of well-funded aid organizations, gliding through checkpoints like VIP guests at a private club. No inspections, no questions. Because, of course, who would dare question a truck with a giant agro-aid sticker plastered on the side? Asking to check the cargo would be considered rude, maybe even undermining trust. And here's the joke, if you can call it that. These so-called humanitarian lanes were designed for efficiency. But efficiency for whom? For the child in Gao who never made it to their 5th birthday? Or for the traffickers who knew that a logo and a stamped document were better than any bribe? This is the part where I have to ask, why is it that the same governments pushing these inspection exemptions are the ones whose companies keep popping up in the paperwork of these suspicious shipments? Coincidence or convenience? If you've ever wondered why Africa's partners are obsessed with controlling the corridors but never the content, drop your thoughts below. And hit share, because the fewer people who know how these corridors really work, the better it is for the people who built them. Then came the night of August 14th, when an encrypted call lit up the Sahel Regional Command Terminal. On the other end, intelligence from Gao, Mali, a city wedged between military zones and rebel-held lands. Something was moving, an unmarked convoy slipping past local checkpoints like it owned the place. No license plates, no transponders, but all the swagger of someone who knew the rules didn't apply to them. At the center of the response stood Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. He's not the type to wait for permission slips from Paris or polite nods from Brussels. The moment he heard unmarked trucks and European aid logos, his instinct was simple: track, watch, and strike at the right time. Here's the twist. The route they took wasn't just suspicious. It was an old petroleum transport line, officially classified low risk and abandoned since French forces scaled back operations. In other words, a perfect ghost road. No one was watching. No one was supposed to be watching. But Traore was watching. His team lit up infrared drones, and what they saw wasn't sacks of seed grain. It was heat. Steady, unnatural heat. Seeds don't radiate like that unless they've learned to boil themselves. Now pause and think about it. How many aid convoys in the past rolled quietly along this same forgotten road, carrying God knows what into the heart of the Sahel, while every foreign advisor nodded reassuringly and said, "All is well." If you're already starting to wonder whether those so-called guardians of African stability have been playing a very different game, you're not alone. Hit like if you think Captain Traore was right to ignore the calls that would soon start flooding in. For the next 14 hours, Traore's team tracked the convoy in complete silence. The trucks crept south under cover of darkness, sticking religiously to that abandoned petroleum route. Every kilometer was mapped, every stop timed to the second. When the lead truck finally crossed into Burkina Faso at 6:03 a.m., the captain gave the order that would shake two continents, a total lockdown of the northern border. 6 hours, no exceptions. Civilian roads, aid lanes, commercial freight, sealed. In an instant, 12 outposts and 11 satellite relays executed the command. And for the first time in modern West African history, a sovereign government had shut down a multinational corridor without a single nod from a Western liaison. What happened next? Predictable. Calls poured in from French security advisors, encrypted pings from EU development officials, messages from UN field monitors. All ignored. That alone was enough to send the diplomatic circuits into a quiet panic, because ignoring the right people has a way of exposing who's really in charge. And here's where the data starts to sting. Once the convoy was digitally mapped, AI algorithms overlaid its path with past NGO traffic. The result? At least 3 other convoys in the past year had followed almost the exact same route, 89% identical, to be precise. None declared proper cargo manifests. All vanished without inspection. Now ask yourself, are we meant to believe this is incompetence, or is it choreography? That the same aid corridors, exempt from checks, just happen to be the perfect smuggling lanes for the purest meth on the European market? If you still think this is about charity, I've got a bridge to sell you. And here's the kicker. QR codes on the seized containers matched uninspected cargo that entered through Lagos and Cotonou in 2023, shipments that supposedly went to research compounds in coastal Europe. None of these had ever been cleared by ECOWAS ministries. The approval stamps? From a private audit firm in Antwerp subcontracted through 3 shell logistics companies. Still think Africa's problem is capacity. Or maybe it's the capacity of others to keep a straight face while running poison through our open doors. If this is what passes for humanitarian trade, what else has been sliding past the blindfold? Comment your thoughts, because the silence on this side of the world is exactly what keeps the system alive. The moment the evidence went public, the machine spun into gear. Western headlines rolled out like they'd been drafted in the same office. Burkina Faso detains EU relief shipment. Human rights concerns over aid interception. Not a single one led with 90 million euros of high-purity meth found in aid trucks. Instead, the narrative was carefully reshaped. Medical-grade biological materials seized. Standoff in Ouagadougou. Apparently, crystal meth is now an agricultural input, and drug busts are diplomatic incidents. Let's not pretend this is just sloppy journalism. This is framing. This is what happens when the same institutions that fund the shipments also fund the stories about them. Because if they admit what was actually inside those containers, they'd have to admit who put them there. And here's the satirical cherry on top. When Africa actually defends itself, it becomes the aggressor. The victim is recast as the villain, and the villain disappears into a cloud of euphemisms. Procedural breach. Miscommunication. Aid misunderstanding. Meanwhile, African fact-checkers in Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa verified every document. The West African Union for Security and Transparency endorsed the findings. But you didn't see that on BBC Primetime, did you? It's almost poetic. The institutions that lecture us about transparency somehow lose their glasses when the evidence points in their direction. If you've noticed this pattern before, when the facts don't fit, they simply rewrite the headline, hit like. And if you're tired of being told what to think about your own continent, drop "we see you" in the comments. Let's make sure the story they're trying to bury ends up everywhere they don't want it to be. What happened in the days that followed wasn't just a national story. It became a continental spark. For decades, African states have been played against each other, competing for donor approval like contestants in a rigged talent show. This time was different. Ghana's president Nana Akufo went on national television and said it plainly. Burkina Faso has every right to investigate any cargo crossing its borders. Sovereignty is not a privilege, it is a responsibility. Mali's leadership went further, calling Captain Traore a necessary flame in a region long smothered by hypocrisy. That's not the language of caution. That's a signal flare. Then Nigeria's president weighed in, expressing concern over multinational exploitation operating under goodwill mandates. Algeria and Chad didn't just talk. They pledged legal teams to help trace historical entry points for suspected dual-use shipments. South Africa offered its anti-smuggling AI for pilot programs in Mali. Even Sierra Leone, a country rarely in the security spotlight, proposed a public ledger of all aid transits, reviewed quarterly by civil society panels. For the first time in living memory, Africa wasn't just reacting as scattered nations. It was speaking with one voice, and it wasn't asking for permission. And the reaction from the partners? A mixture of diplomatic frowns and thinly veiled threats. One European Union statement called Burkina Faso's actions a breach of procedural trust, which is a fancy way of saying, how dare you check what we send you? Think about the absurdity. If a homeowner checks what's coming through his own front door, is he breaching trust with the delivery man? But here's the truth they don't want to admit. When African countries start verifying their own borders, the real risk isn't to humanitarian aid. It's to the shadow economy that's been hiding inside it. Let's be honest, unity like this terrifies the system. An Africa that shares data, scans cargo, and calls out bad actors publicly is an Africa that can't be quietly exploited. If you believe continental solidarity is our strongest weapon, drop your country's name in the comments. And if you think it's time to turn this spark into a permanent firewall against exploitation, hit share. Because the more people hear this, the harder it is for them to break the chain. Let's strip away the polite language and look at the machinery for what it really is. For over a decade, international agreements have carved out inspection exemption zones in West Africa. These are corridors where cargo can move without scrutiny under the banner of humanitarian efficiency. Sounds noble, doesn't it? Until you start asking the obvious. Who benefits from a blind spot? Certainly not the grandmother in Gao burying her second grandson because methamphetamines have flooded the streets. Certainly not the farmers watching their youth disappear into addiction. No, the beneficiaries are those who can move anything: drugs, arms, unlicensed chemicals, with a diplomatic fast pass stamped and ready. This isn't theoretical. In the Burkina Faso seizure alone, forensic analysis found synthetic methylamine with purity levels exceeding European industrial regulations, labeled as anti-pest liquid, for reforestation projects. And this wasn't a one-off. The approval trail led back to an anonymous office suite in Luxembourg. No staff, no working phone, a website registered through a masking service. Funding traced to a pharmaceutical conglomerate already caught violating export controls for chemical precursors. Now, tell me, how many government ministers, policy advisors, and development consultants had to look the other way for this to pass through not once but multiple times? The answer isn't we didn't know, it's we didn't want to know. And when Captain Traore made the evidence public, refusing closed-door diplomacy, the real panic set in. Not because of what he found, but because of the precedent he set, an African state exposing the receipts in daylight. That's why the EU rushed to issue statements about trust and procedure, and why certain Western outlets bent over backwards to avoid using the word drugs. It's not about the meth, it's about control. If Africa proves it can police its own borders, the illusion of dependency crumbles. Here's the irony worth savoring. The same powers that preach transparency built an entire shadow network that depends on Africans never looking too closely. And the moment someone does, they cry foul. So let me ask you, in a system designed to keep you blind, what's the greater crime? Breaking the rules or breaking the silence? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you think the silence has gone on long enough, hit like and share this, because daylight is the one thing this network can't survive. It's easy to get lost in the numbers: tons seized, purity percentages, millions in street value. But behind those statistics are lives shattered in ways that don't make it into press releases. In Gao, a grandmother named Aissata buried her second grandson last year. The first one died in a street fight fueled by meth addiction. The second overdosed on a batch so pure, local clinics had no protocol for saving him. She didn't read the chemical analysis reports. She didn't follow international trade agreements. All she knows is that the streets are less safe every year, and the aid trucks keep rolling past her home. In Niamey, Musa, 24, once dreamed of running his own mechanic shop. Instead, he's watching half his friends slip into the haze of synthetic drugs that, according to the packaging, were supposed to protect crops. Protect crops? That's rich. Crops aren't the ones ending up in emergency rooms. These are the people who pay the price for humanitarian efficiency. The system calls it aid. The communities call it poison. And here's where the Cham BM cuts sharpest. While diplomats debate procedural trust in air-conditioned conference halls, border towns bury their dead. The cost of looking the other way isn't measured in GDP points. It's measured in empty chairs at the dinner table. Now, ask yourself, how many more Aisadas and Musas will it take before Africa decides that no logo, no matter how well-funded, is above inspection? If you believe every shipment, no matter its flag, should face the same scrutiny, say so in the comments. And if you think it's time to put lives ahead of logos, share this story, because the people living it rarely get a microphone. The morning after the international headlines tried to twist the story, Burkina Faso's government made its answer clear. Operation Sahara Sands. Clean corridor would begin immediately. No press conference fluff, no symbolic posturing. 11 strategic border points across the Sahelian belt were marked for permanent high-resolution scanning posts. These aren't just any scanners. We're talking mobile adaptive systems capable of penetrating chemical tanks, insulated containers, even NGO-labeled shipments that used to slide through unchecked. Every truck, every crate, every logo, inspected. The era of friendly lanes for friendly donors, over. And here's where it gets deliciously uncomfortable for the system. Interpol signed a 5-year data-sharing protocol. Their risk vector index, usually reserved for high-severity narcotics traffic in Latin America, would now include West African humanitarian routes for the first time since 2008. Translation: the game has changed. But the real breakthrough came not from Europe or Washington. It came from African cooperation. Nigeria's Interior Ministry called an emergency caucus. Chad and Algeria sent delegations to Ouagadougou. Together, they pitched Africanet Clean Transit, a continental initiative to sync customs data, scan signatures, and GPS tracking for all cross-border development cargo. Technically, it's a digital firewall. Politically, it's rebellion. Because once Africa controls the data, it controls the narrative, and the corridors suddenly belong to the continent, not the donors. Of course, this is where the Cham BM writes itself. You can already hear the think tank panels in Brussels. We support African-led solutions, provided they don't actually lead. So here's my question to you. If defending your home is now considered aggressive, is that aggression exactly what Africa needs? Drop your take in the comments. And if you think the Clean Corridor Plan should be the baseline, not the exception, hit share. Because the louder this gets, the harder it is for them to kill it quietly. What Captain Ibrahim Traore pulled off in just 48 hours was never meant to be the final scene. It was the first shot in a fight the system never thought it would have to face. Because this isn't a battle you win once. Every corridor scanned, every shipment checked, every document made public chips away. At a machine that has been running for decades in the dark. You can bet those who profit from it aren't rolling over. They're already adapting, already plotting the next move. And here's the kind of satire they won't be able to laugh off. The same countries that once told Africa, you can't protect yourselves, will soon be sending delegations asking for African cooperation to protect their own supply chains. The moment we own the data and the checkpoints, we own the narrative. The truth is, what happened in Burkina Faso could happen anywhere on the continent. If leaders decide that sovereignty isn't just a word for speeches, but a policy for survival. The question now is, how many will take that leap and how quickly? Because this story isn't over. The convoys will keep coming. The calls to trust the process will get louder. The headlines will keep trying to rewrite reality. And every time they do, we'll have a choice. Play along or pull back the curtain again. If you believe more leaders need to follow Traore's lead, don't just agree silently. Drop Africa Rise in the comments. Share this story until it reaches the very rooms where they think no one is watching. This isn't the end. It's the start of a countdown, and they don't control the clock anymore.